something we can talk about later. But right now they're busy working, so we'll leave it at that. Go ahead.
It's easy to sit back and say, oh, what could have happened here or there, you know. Maybe we could have done something differently. This was a thing that has never happened before. And nobody's ever seen anything. I've never seen anything like this.
Even sometimes before a presidential declaration or before the state asks, you do need the declaration to employ them, right? To put them to work. But the agility, that speed is so important.
Did Nicolle Wallace just call Trump out with a single word? Viewers were stunned. The crowd booed. And Trump's reaction, let's just say it wasn't one for the history books. But what was this one word? And why did it cause such outrage? Stick around because it's not just about Trump. It's about alleged failures that cost lives. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video.
This time-lapse video shows just how quickly the waters rose there, swamping a highway in a matter of minutes. The Guadalupe River rose by 26 feet in just 45 minutes, catching countless people by surprise. Here's how some people have described what happened. At least 90 people have lost their lives. Many others are still missing after catastrophic flash flooding Friday morning along the Guadalupe River. What looked like a shrug from Donald Trump when he was confronted with questions about the possibility that the federal government fell short in warning Texas residents and that his administration's gutting of federal agencies.
Picture this, a small Texas town drowning, not just in water, but in fear and despair. When the floods hit, the walls of homes weren't the only thing crumbling. People's confidence in the government's ability to act quickly was swept away too. It was water up to rooftops, roads devoured by currents, and families screaming for help that wasn't coming anytime soon. The situation was desperate, but folks thought surely the federal government had to step in, right? After all, that's what administrations brag about, helping Americans in their worst moments. But in this case, help was caught in a web of bureaucracy that made a spider's web look like child's play. Now, CNN reported on something that left jaws dropping. Critical federal aid was delayed by more than 72 hours. That's 3 days of people clinging to trees, waiting for rescue boats, not knowing if their next breath would be underwater. Why the holdup? Apparently, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, couldn't approve any spending over $100,000 without a nice little stamp of approval from the Department of Homeland Security. For a government that loves telling us how powerful it is, you'd think they'd figure out how to cut through their own red tape to save a few lives. But nope. FEMA sat in bureaucratic limbo, and meanwhile the flood victims were stuck with nothing. No food, no clean drinking water, no way out. Families who had only minutes to grab their children or pets were now left wondering, was help ever coming? And speaking of heartbreaking examples, let's take a moment to talk about the storm's victims. Families huddled on rooftops as snakes slithered through the water below. Rescue crews trying to reach those stranded found themselves idling with boats and trucks, but no resources. They were ready to save lives, but they didn't have the tools. Meanwhile, time was running out. A mother with 3 kids described waiting 15 hours on top of a neighbor's house as the floodwaters rose an inch every few minutes. Imagine staring at water creeping up towards your shivering kids while the government is tangled up in approval processes. Approval processes for life or death situations. You can't make this stuff up. But here's where it gets even messier. When the administration was finally questioned about these delays, the response was about as disconnected as you'd expect. In official statements, they had the audacity to call their disaster response a historic success. That's right, families were swimming for their lives, but Grumpy Trumpy and company were patting each other on the back. These weren't just delays, they were deadly delays. Some residents who got caught by the flood never made it out alive. For crying out loud, how do you call that a historic success? Maybe if you're measuring success in terms of how bad your optics can get. Now, of course, Trump's administration couldn't just quietly accept blame. Oh no. Instead, they doubled down, spinning the press with excuses and cherry-picking stats to show how much they helped. Meanwhile, Nicolle Wallace, yes, we'll get to her infamous one word in the next part, was not having it. She called out what many of us couldn't help but notice. While the administration bragged, countless Americans were left behind. And the cherry on top? Allegations surfaced that federal resources were being funneled into other pet projects instead of actual disaster relief. Officials like Christine Owen, known for her loyalty over competence, were already under fire for decisions that smelled more like PR stunts than real action. This wasn't just a flooding crisis anymore, it was a moral one. How much more obvious did it need to be that priorities were in the wrong place? And let's not forget the bigger irony here. FEMA, and by extension the Trump administration, had spent months brushing off the effects of climate change. Let me tell you, nothing makes you look dumber than being caught unprepared for a climate-related disaster after years of pretending it's fake. Nicolle Wallace later connected some of those dots, pointing out how the administration was essentially squashing scientific consensus while cities drowned. Climate denial mixed with a clunky, rigid system of approvals. It's like a recipe for incompetence. In the end, the only thing historic about this was how it exposed systematic failures everywhere. You had homes destroyed, lives lost, and people devastated, not just from Mother Nature, but by political dysfunction and a complete lack of urgency at the top. And then came Nicolle Wallace. Remember those defensive stats and the proclamations of success? She shredded them using just one word, and suddenly everything they tried to smokescreen became impossible to hide. What was the word? Oh, it's coming up, and let me just say Trump's face when she said it was priceless. What if the weight of an entire administration's failures could be captured in just one word? Live on air. Nicolle Wallace handed Trump what might be his most humiliating moment yet. And it wasn't just the word she used, but the fact that she left an entire studio of viewers gasping and booing while Trump sat there, caught completely off guard. It all started during an MSNBC broadcast where Wallace didn't waste a second sugarcoating her thoughts on the administration's response to the Texas floods. The setup was sharp and direct, her delivery pointed. "This is an abomination of an administration," she said, her tone layered with both frustration and disbelief. "It's sickening the way they operate, how they act like they're solving America's problems, when in reality, they're just serving their billionaire buddies and feeding their own egos. It's gross, plain and simple." You could feel the heat radiating from her words. The camera immediately cut to Trump as the word abomination seemed to hang in the air longer than usual. For a split second, the look on his face was priceless, wide-eyed and visibly startled, like he'd just been slapped by truth itself. That's when you could hear it. The crowd, the collective mix of boos, gasps, and scattered applause, with even some of his most loyal fans squirming in their seats. Now, let's talk about what led up to Wallace unleashing that single word, because this wasn't just some offhand comment. It was her takedown of a system that didn't just fail. It failed catastrophically. Wallace pointed out what many Americans had been screaming at their TVs for days. At a time when the federal government was needed most, resources were allegedly bottled up or redirected to, as she implied, vanity projects. One example? Christine Owen, a senior official and loyal Trump appointee, was dragged into the spotlight for reportedly treating government resources like her personal playthings. According to reports, Owen focused more on luxurious travel arrangements and staging what critics have called cosplay-like political events rather than managing the disaster efforts. So, while Texans were paddling through murky floodwaters and begging for provisions, Owen was accused of wasting time pretending to oversee operations for the cameras. It's stuff like this that turned a natural disaster into a political train wreck. Wallace didn't just stop there. She made sure to highlight not only the immediate response failures, but the longer-term cracks in the foundation, starting with climate change denial. She called out how ignoring climate realities directly impacted disaster preparedness, hammering in the fact that the administration had repeatedly dismissed scientific warnings about worsening flood risks. How could you take proactive measures when half the leadership doesn't even believe there's a problem? They've turned ignoring reality into a strategy. Wallace noted, a phrase that seemed to echo the frustration of so many Americans watching yet another preventable crisis unfold. And let's not forget Trump's famous line dismissing climate change as a hoax, which Wallace tied directly to the administration's lack of actionable plans for disaster resilience. It wasn't just negligence, it was intentional ignorance. The tension in that room was unmatched. You had folks on both sides of the political aisle reacting, some with outrage, others clearly trying to hide their discomfort. Even Trump himself began shifting in his chair, looking anywhere except the camera. His usual bravado, his signature deflection tactics, none of it seemed to work here. And when Wallace dropped abomination, she wasn't just leveling a critique. She was summarizing with brutal efficiency what so many had been feeling for weeks, but hadn't said so bluntly. It was like the word cracked the glossy finish of Trump's defense wide open, leaving everybody, even his supporters, staring at the ugly truth underneath. Think about it. Abomination. It's not just a critique of what happened during the floods. It's a loaded term. It calls out the failures, yes, but also the hypocrisy of an administration that claimed to care about forgotten Americans only to leave them forgotten in the moments they needed help most. Wallace was essentially saying what everyone else was too afraid to say, that this disaster, and by extension this administration, wasn't just bad at its job, it was a moral failure. Plain and simple. And the reaction? Let's just say it was loud, divided, and a little chaotic. The boos from the audience weren't just boos at Trump. They were boos at the whole circus. The delays, the excuses, the spin. You could feel the anger, the betrayal, and frankly, the exhaustion from a country that's been through one too many preventable disasters. What made this even more remarkable was the way Wallace stood firm, completely unfazed by the noise. She had her facts lined up and delivered every point with the sharpness of someone who's fed up with hearing the same tired excuses over and over. By the end of the segment, the word abomination became more than just an insult. It became a label, a single word summing up years of dysfunction, short-sighted policies, and disastrous priorities. And for once, Trump, the man of endless comebacks, couldn't pin it on fake news or liberal bias. Maybe because deep down, he knew how much of it rang true. So now the question becomes, where does this lead? Will this moment push for real changes in disaster response systems? Or will it just become another soundbite lost in the endless noise of politics? Whatever comes next, Wallace's blunt critique wasn't just a verbal attack on Trump. It was a spotlight on what happens when incompetence and ego take the wheel during a crisis. If this administration was an abomination, what does that say about who's left to pick up the pieces? Nicolle Wallace's takedown wasn't just about Trump, it was about something bigger. The price we all pay when leadership fails. Moments like these remind us that public servants don't work for a president, they work for the people. And when those in power fumble during a crisis, the consequences aren't just political, they're personal. Lives are destroyed, trust is eroded, and we're left asking how it ever got this bad. If accountability doesn't matter when lives are literally at stake, then when will it? Sometimes one word reveals the truth. But fixing it, that takes all of us, and it has to start now.